Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 14th week of 2014. For almost a quarter century, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-some years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misrepresented, misreported, sometimes even innocently, in the media, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Today is April 4th. On this day in 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, it would not surprise you that this was a U.S. initiative. It was part of the post-war rearrangement, economic and political, that resulted from the United States emerging from the Second World War as the only undamaged major country amongst the winners or the losers. And the ability of the United States to organize the world after 1945 should not be minimized. Our mythology is that there was a vast Cold War between the victors of World War II in Europe, that is the U.S. and the USSR. That's false in several scores. First of all, the victor in Europe was clearly the USSR. The major fighting in the Second World War, even after the invasion of Normandy down to May of 1945, was all carried out on the Eastern Front, on the Russian front, and the Russians lost far more people in the war than any other country, and was far more damaged economically and every other way resulted in as a result of the war. But the U.S. moved quickly to organize the world after 1945, particularly as there were signs that the Depression, which had been solved only by war production, was looking like returning. And so the American government needed a war footing in order to maintain the controls on the economy that had prevented the Great Depression from continuing. We needed a war. And there was the obvious opponent, that is Russia. And so we had several generations of America growing up with the notion that Russia was about to descend on Europe and was about to take Connecticut and several other places probably as a result. Not noticing such things as that in 1945 half the Russian Army's mechanized division were horse-drawn. And this was the army that was supposed to leap across the Atlantic and attack the United States, or even attack Western Europe. In response to the propaganda assault, the U.S. constructed a organization which brought the European nations' militaries essentially under American control. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, designed to oppose that Russian advance across the Atlantic, has turned out, as we see today in Afghanistan and elsewhere, to be the American government's method of controlling European military and using it for its own purposes. That's what NATO has become, and NATO is involved not only in American control of the Middle East, but also in the current kerfuffle with Russia, which threatens to become worse than that, depending upon what the U.S. government does. But it is NATO and the extension of NATO and the expansion of NATO that's finally at stake in the Russian and American set-off over Ukraine. Today is also another anniversary. On this day in 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in London unveiled a new symbol. The symbol was what's come to be known as the peace symbol, often confused with the symbol of Mercedes-Benz, but in fact it's different. The peace symbol is the semaphore signal for N and D, nuclear disarmament. And they, of course, in 1958 were very much on to the serious issue that such things as the construction of NATO presaged. The U.S. nuclear arsenal will cost $355 billion over the next 10 years, that is from now to 10 years out. This is the Obama administration's plan. About $1 trillion, in other words, over the next generation. So the nuclear weapons have not gone away, even when presidents can't pronounce it. And the continuation of American policy is bound up with the same policy that has given us NATO for 2 generations and an aggressive American military policy around the world. Of course, the United States is not alone in the arms race, and it is, in fact, a near miracle that we have not had a nuclear exchange since the last time the United States used nuclear weapons against an enemy. We know in principle how to overcome this threat. Simply get rid of the nuclear weapons. And although it wasn't much reported in the media, there was actually a meeting in Europe about that, part of President Obama's recent trip to Europe a week ago last Monday. You sure didn't hear much about it from this administration or even in the media because, of course, there are no serious efforts moving in the direction that everyone realizes we should go, that is, to the elimination of nuclear weapons. There is, of course, another dire peril that casts its shadow over any contemplation in the future, environmental disaster. It's not clear that there even is an escape, as there is for nuclear weapons, although the longer we delay, the more severe the threat becomes, and not in the distant future at all. The commitment of governments to the security of their populations is therefore clearly exhibited by how they address this issue, environmental catastrophe. Today, the United States is crowing about 100 years of energy independence as the country becomes, quote, the Saudi Arabia of the next century. That's the Obama administration's position. And very likely, as Noam Chomsky says, the final century of human civilization if current policies persist. You're watching News from Neptune and Oh No, NATO edition. And Ron Szoke will begin. It's the smoke from the departing railroad train, I think, that got me there, Ron. Ron Szoke will have the first burst of dismay.
Are you insulting working men?
No, just your hat.
Oh, okay. We're toiling in the zoo of ideology and politics here, and trying to clean out the cages occasionally, but anyway, I thought maybe we were going to talk about capitalism today and the Piketty book. Do you intend to go back to that, or what?
We've announced that a couple of times as a theme. I had not particular plan for that today, although it's certainly worthwhile, and it should be, I think, part of our discussion in general. We're talking here about an important book recently published by Harvard University Press in an English translation from the French original of Thomas Piketty, a French economist. The book is entitled Capital in the 21st Century. And in a massive and careful study, he simply, finally, argues for the ways in which capitalism, as it is currently constituted, will continue to make for increasing inequality in the self-described capitalist states. It's very important, I think.
Yeah, well, whenever we get back to that, I want to talk a bit about the bear market, B-A-R-E,
okay,
and what that does to cultures and societies that attempt to implement it.
Bear market?
Yeah, right. And with indirect.
VEAR.
No, I think he has something else in mind.
Right. Well, VARE is what I'm talking about.
I was
but-
afraid of that.
Yeah. And what happens inevitably, I think, to societies that attempt to implement the ideology of the market alone determining the value or worth of anything. I remember reading once, it's kind of vague to me now, that there are three basic kinds of economic systems: traditional, command, and the market ideology. And we have this persistent tendency in this country of the wealthy people particularly to say that we've gone too far in the direction of a traditional or command economy, and we should become a completely market economy, but that's intolerable. No society can live that way. Every actual existing society, I think, that's ever existed in the real world has been some combination of the three, without trying to eliminate any one or two of them entirely. And that's the only thing that makes life in these societies inevitable. So you can see some of this conflict emerging, this ideological conflict, around such topics as surrogate motherhood. And should people be able, women especially, be able to enter into contracts freely to rent out their womb for 9 months so that they can bear some other couple's child, which will have no genetic relationship to the woman that bears it. And our free market ideologists seem to be split on that kind of issue, and they don't want government making rules about this, regulations, requirements, restrictions. And so it'd be interesting to ask my colleagues here what their judgments are about that. Should surrogate motherhood to be tolerated or encouraged or forbidden or penalized or what? It's a very interesting. Number of women in India of proven fertility are making their living this way now. They're typically being given from $5,000 to $10,000 to do the gestation job for wealthy couples from England and the USA and other places in Europe. And I think it's an interesting topic, but we'll have to come back to that. In a recent article by Paul Krugman on America's taxation tradition, he says that capital in the 21st century, a landmark book by the economist Thomas Piketty, points out that America, which introduced an income tax in 1913 and an inheritance tax in 1916, led the way in the rise of progressive taxation, that it was far out in front of Europe. Mr. Piketty goes so far as to say that the confiscatory taxation, of excessive incomes, that is taxation whose goal was to reduce income and wealth disparities rather than to raise money, was an American invention. So it's a very American idea, despite all the people who try to tell you otherwise. So a completely laissez-faire economy has never been tolerable for very long anywhere, and it's interesting to look into the reasons for that and what happens. There's still a lot of talk about our economic situation by people who seem to be embrace what I would call folk economics, or sometimes kitchen table economics, and appeal to common sense. And this is a favorite target of mine. If common sense would solve our political and economic problems, they would have been solved centuries ago. But they've become so complex and ambiguous and many-sided that we can't do that anymore. So the result of this, of trying to push us toward a market economy, is that this thing that keeps coming up in here again and again, and that schools and colleges should be run like a business. And this has some small degree of merit because they are embedded in a society in which the prevailing ideology and social forces are indeed matters of the market, or some people tell us that they should be. But it seems to me there's a major step in going from schools and colleges should be run like a business to saying that they should be a business. That is a profit-making business. And again, this is a big theme that we'll have to come back to again and again. David Green, who's often here, liked to talk about this. And we've seen the result of it in schools and colleges being run on a for-profit basis, and what that has led to, which I'll go into at some other time. A traditional market, then, is one based upon mores, sentiments, feelings of family, brotherhood, tribalism, if you like. And that's the basis of what's done is what always has been done, according to the people who have been there. And there's supposed to be a deep wisdom in these traditions, and sometimes I have to doubt that, but anyway, that's the line. The command economy is the one that we're often argued, warned against, that it's what the Soviet Union did, and what could be worse than that. So in a command economy, the norms are laid down by some authority, and there's always been some element of this. Whenever there are two people in interaction, one of them will be turn out to be dominant over the other, typically, and will begin to set forth certain norms about the activity of the other, and those can be norms of economic activity as well as anything else. So the third alternative then is the market economy, in which everything is centered upon buying and selling, getting and spending. And when that happens, as someone has warned us in the past, everything becomes a commodity, and all of the solid melts into air. And it's curious, the disappearance of reality under those conditions is a fascinating subject, and one about which many books have been written and many more deserve to be written. As I mentioned, every actually operating real-world economic system has had ingredients of all three, I think. And the question is, which one is dominant? So every actually existing economic system is located somewhere in the kind of conceptual triangle that those three make, the traditional command and market economies. So if we think we have a market economy, then, or should have, then we have to acquiesce in the notion, which you'll find explicit in certain economic textbooks, Samuelson going back to the 70s. Everything has a price, a market price. Every good, every service. So you can't complain about that. You're just trying to impose your subjective preferences on other people, and it's assumed that they know what's good for them, and there should be no barriers put in the way of them getting that if they can afford it and pay the money for it. So the advocates of this position, everything has a price, the free market ideology, usually do not mention certain implications of this view, especially concerning narcotics, pornography, and prostitution. And some have taken up the challenge. There's a book called Ain't Nobody's Business If You Do. It's about decriminalizing victimless crimes, as they're called. And it's a very interesting read that the libertarians and extreme free marketers talk about from time to time without telling you about what the implications of their views really might be. But this whole ideology, which began to develop, well, you can always find precursors of it, of course. There's always been an element, I would say, of the capitalist mentality of acquiring more resources and using them to acquire further resources, using money to set up a business and make still more money. That, to me, is the essence of capitalism. And there's always been an element of that. And in itself, it's not greatly harmful if the results are kept on a small scale so that they don't distort the entire society. But when they become huge social and political factors, then that's another matter entirely, and some limits have to be set. A line needs to be drawn somewhere beyond which there will indeed have to be rules, regulations, restrictions, requirements in the name of the common good or the great majority of the public good. If you don't believe that a common good exists or the public welfare, then you will fight that, and you will get such excrescences as this manifesto of Charles Koch, K-O-C-H, that appeared in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Another petulant plutocrat who thinks he's being persecuted. Charles Koch, I'm fighting to restore a free society. Instead of welcoming free debate, collectivists engaged in character assassination. So the fundamental concepts, according to Mr. Koch, are under attack by the nation's own government. And he said, we have no choice. Who the we is, I'm not sure. The very rich, the 1%, the 1/10 of, or 100th of 1%, or what, to fight for those principles. I have long been doing so for more than 50 years, but only in the last 10 years has it become political. Collectivists, he says, those who stand for the government control of the means of production and how people live their lives, promise heaven, but deliver hell. For them, the promised end justifies the means. So what's amazing to me is all of the most successful, highly placed people that I've never ever met or heard anything about. What impresses me most about those people is the utter banality of their minds. But anyway, he goes on to ring the self-pity bell again. All of the operations of the government, he says, hinders innovation, relegates millions of citizens to a life of poverty, dependency, and hopelessness. This is what happens when elected officials believe that people's lives are better run by politicians and regulators than by the people themselves. Mm-hmm. Those in power fail to see that the more government means less liberty, and liberty is the essence of what it means to be American. Love of liberty is the American ideal. So wave the flag and start screaming for freedom. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has again told us that there shouldn't be any aggregate limit on political spending. So here's another article in the New York Times, March 20th. The Koch Group, spending freely, hones attack on government. So this is down with the government stuff. And another report on our third oligarch, very much in the news recently, Sheldon Adelson, who is reported to have spent $93 million in the 2012, and a few examples of where he put his money. Restore Our Future, the Mitt Romney Super PAC, $30 million. American Crossroads, the GOP-aligned Super PAC, $23 million. Winning Our Future, the Newt Gingrich Super PAC, $15 million, and so on. He has his own, actually, Republican Jewish Coalition Victory Fund. He only put $2 million into that. So there was a very interesting article in the New York Times recently about the people who showed up at his one of his big hotels in Las Vegas, kind of auditioning to receive his millions in the future. Chris Christie put his foot in his mouth by talking about the occupied territories in Israel, and promptly apologized for it after other people realized what he had said, because Adelson is one of the most fanatical of the pro-Israel billionaires around, and he always insists on that kind of talk from the people he supports. But with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. Reactions to that? There's a good deal there, eh?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to start with the rent-a-body topic that
Yes.
Ron brought up.
Yeah.
You know, in what people do, consenting adults do, if someone wants to be a surrogate for someone else, that's fine. That's their business. I don't think the government or should be involved. I'm a strong supporter of adoption, okay? But my feeling is that's between individuals. However, when it does come to the money passing hands, well, how does it differ that much when women have to resort to carrying babies, like you mentioned in India, where you're talking about poverty?
Yes.
That's where it's being done in order to survive. It doesn't differ significantly from prostitution, though it's preferable to prostitution. I think it's a much better outcome, so to speak. But you know, I think it all boils down to poverty. I mean, there are always those people, there are always going to be those who are going to want to be a surrogate for money. There are always going to be women who want to be prostitutes for money. But it really boils down to poverty. And until we alleviate such poverty, we're not going to alleviate this issue. In fact, it transfers over even to selling of body organs. And we know that this is happening. It's on the black market. And in fact, there's a movement now. I saw a documentary whereby there is a movement. They're trying to get the government to support this, meaning where the government would pay individuals for donating their body organs. And it's interesting because at first I was rather horrified at the thought, but then the details that they presented, it began to sound like, well, maybe that is something we should do because there are not enough organs out there. But again, think about it. Why does somebody sell their liver or their kidney? I mean, you know, it's obviously it's due to poverty. And so as far as I'm concerned, any discussion of any of this as to, again, it's a distraction, and I think it takes us away from the main issues. As Noam Chomsky has said recently, we face two major disasters or catastrophes are facing humanity. One is nuclear war. Anything could happen, and this is something he's been talking about for a very long time.
Because the threat's been there for a very long time, and it's still there in spite of what people think, yes.
And that's why he's bringing it up again, is the fact that, you know, nobody's really talking about it, but the threat is still there and getting worse all the time.
Yes.
Plus, of course, climate change. You know, I mean, we can't, you know, discuss this without recognizing the seriousness of it and the fact that governments, especially our government, is doing so little about it. These are major catastrophes. But then there's the poverty issue. As people continue to sink into further poverty, food and water is going to become so critical, much more critical to the survival, and of course to the poor primarily. So the eradication of poverty. Now, where do we go with this? Back to what you were talking about, both of you have been talking about for a long time, and that is some of the issues with the government and with politics. And this recent Supreme Court ruling has placed us in a no-hope situation to get money and power out of voting and politics.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at least there was hope until that issue came out this week. I think that's very, very major.
There's a lot of important things, I think, that Ron's brought up here and that you've commented on, Karen. But since that one is current, so to speak, the McCutcheon decision, let's take a moment on that. And
Good.
I'm willing to defend the notion that Citizens United and McCutcheon were both rightly decided. Under the circumstances, in other words, I'm saying that I would have voted with the majority had I been on the Supreme Court in both of those cases. Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah, let me suggest why. I mean, I you know,
I want to hear this.
the general circumstance is the one that you've both been talking about. You know, the overwhelming influence of the very rich in American society and the vast inequality that exists in what is now the most unequal of the industrialized societies, that is the United States of America. we recently passed Australia, I think. Australia was considered more unequal because of the poverty of the Aborigines, but the U.S. has even outdone that now, and we have more inequality in the U.S. than they do in Australia. But let's look at McCutcheon and Citizens United here. What the Supreme Court said was that the limits placed on money that could be spent in election campaigns, primarily for advertising, should be minimized. That is, people who want to buy ads for a candidate or contribute money to a candidate to buy ads and so forth may do so, that they have indeed a First Amendment right to do so. And to try to stop them from doing so is to interfere with their First Amendment rights. I think that argument is probably right. And it doesn't destroy the argument to say that means that rich people have an undue influence in advertising. Yes, that's certainly true. And as Ron and I particularly have mentioned again and again on this program, one of the principal characteristics of modern American society is the vast development of public relations, of advertising and so forth. It's hard to imagine that it wouldn't influence elections as well. Let me make just two more points about this. One is that even if you were to reverse Citizens United and McCutcheon, the influence of money through advertising in American politics would continue. All McCutcheon does is sort of remove a fig leaf. And we say, oh my goodness, there's money influencing politics. Yes, there is, and there influenced political advertising. Yes, there is, and it has been all along. And it's simply a question of how they do it. For example, before McCutcheon, the standard way in which a very rich person would contribute to a campaign, a political campaign, is through a political action committee. What McCutcheon said is that you don't have to go through the political action committee anymore. You can give it straight to the candidate. Well, that's a difference without much of a distinction. Or say the other way around, a distinction without much of a difference in the sense that the money goes into the campaign anyhow. We are not, no one would argue that big money has not influenced American political campaigns for a century. Certainly it has. The second point about it is that it would be far better, since most of that money does go for advertising, it would be far better to level the playing field by making advertising free to candidates. In other words, if you said that in something like the recent Democratic primary, which our colleague David Green was a candidate, if you'd say in that primary, in the run-up to that primary, any time a candidate bought an ad in the electronic media, it was incumbent upon the seller of the ad to make available for free an equivalent ad to anyone else who was on the ballot. Now, in our case of our friend David, that would have helped immensely because his two opponents vastly outspent him in terms of advertising. So it seems to me that for all that's been said about it, McCutcheon and Citizens United don't do what their opponents think they do. And the way to do it, what you want to do, that is increase the discussion, is not by limiting the money that can be spent, but by making free ads available to other candidates. What do you think?
That was the basic point of the fairness doctrine, which existed up until the Reagan administration. Then that was eliminated. So.
Yeah, that was much broader and more sweeping. That was, I suppose, any controversial issue or any public policy issue. Television on the basis of the fact that the airwaves belong to the people, both sides, as it was said, had to be presented. You would understand there's an argument for that. It has some difficulties, including the notion that there are only two sides and other problems that have led to its the disappearance of the fairness doctrine. But I'm not talking even about a general publication requirement What I'm talking about is candidates, which is what the McCutcheon's and Citizens United decisions refer to.
Is it, or is it not a fact that 90% of the time the candidate who spends the most in an election wins?
Probably true. Not necessarily true, but probably true. And it seems to me that the only way you can tilt that a bit is not by saying, okay, you can't spend that money, but your opponents have the same access to the public that you do, even if they don't have as much money, which is the essence of my suggestion. So.
Well, I was not talking about anything that's necessarily true or always true or 100% of the time. I said 90% of the time.
No, and I agree with you. I think that may be so. And therefore, so what do you do about that? Well, you try to broaden the discussion, right?
Can you set a limit on the spending? Or are we in a situation where, as Piketty, I haven't put my hands on the book yet, but there are a lot of very interesting reviews of it on Amazon. Is that more and more money tends to accumulate in relatively fewer hands during the ordinary operation of capitalism, and eventually it becomes unbearable. There have to be a social and political break.
And he argues that that's what happened in the 20th century with the Depression and the war, and that that was the corrective, so to speak, and you can see that in the graphs for that concentration of wealth. That's certainly true. Yeah, I think that's right. The concentration of wealth is a different issue here, of course, but the fact that that is not a matter of discussion in our campaigns is itself, I think, a function of the sort of control that that money gives to the public relations industry on political matters. I mean, some things are within an allowable limit of debate, and other things are out. And one of the things that's outside a limit of allowable debate is confiscatory taxation and the readjustment, the redistribution of wealth, which you think might be on the agenda if what Mr. Piketty says is true.
Well, I read Mr. Doug Henwood's
Yes.
review of the Piketty book, and I have to admit that economics is completely over my head, but I did get the last paragraph. I like the last paragraph, where he refers to the fact that he was not vaccinated with this vaccination that communism, socialism is all evil,
Right.
because he evidently was young enough. He didn't have to go through that era, and
It's an interesting point. Yes.
Pointing out, right, which is true, because
Yeah.
I think most people who lived through that era where, the 50s or the 60s, or even the 70s, where, oh my God, they were the, evil incarnate if you were a socialist or a communist. And given how we treated them in
That
this
was
country.
the intellectual
Yes.
triumph of American capitalism.
Yes, exactly. So what he was saying is that for the younger generation that is really suffering a lot of the consequences of capitalism is that the hope that they will rise up against what is happening and perhaps embrace a more humane system of government. I want to make a small quote from a book that I haven't read yet, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It was recommended to me, so I'm going to read it. But he points out at the beginning, now I think he wrote this in early 2000s, something, and this is in respect to a lot of people who think it's all a big conspiracy out there. He says, some would blame our current problems on an organized conspiracy. He said, I wish it were so simple. Members of a conspiracy can be rooted out and brought to justice.
Yes, exactly.
This system, however, is fueled by something far more dangerous than conspiracy. It is driven not by a small band of men, but by a concept that has become so accepted as gospel, the idea that all economic growth benefits humankind, and that the greater the growth, the more widespread the benefits. This belief also has a corollary, that those people who excel at stoking the fires of economic growth should be exalted and rewarded, while those born at the fringes are available for exploitation. And he said this concept is, of course, totally erroneous. And so,
Well, he's referring to the invisible hand, supposedly.
yes,
or-
of many. But,
Yeah.
In relation to the whole concept, I've always embraced socialism, and even though I don't know my marks, again, it's economics and it's way over my head, but just the concept of a more humane society where we don't have people struggling to survive as we do today. So that's just my thinking on that point.
But you demonstrate here each week, Karen, that these matters are not over your head at all. And I think the assertion is itself an artifact of the intellectual formation that's been so important to capitalism. These are abstruse matters that ordinary people can't deal with. Therefore, they should just leave it to experts, and we experts will tell you what to do. By the way, that's a 20th century notion of you could define Leninism, Bolshevism, communism as ruled by experts, just as you could say American capitalism, particularly after after the Great Depression, is ruled by experts, and that leads to a sort of deference, which you shouldn't be showing.
I never really have. I'm okay on the big picture. I get the big picture. I'm just not good with the details.
Yeah. What it leads to is the glorification of the entrepreneur and the kind of mysticism that surrounds that. The businessman, and that's why every institution is supposed to be like a business or to be run as a business, meaning for-profit business.
Right.
Remember what that means, finally. I mean, at the heart of capitalism, as the old man in the British Museum said, there's really a system of establishing a set of rules that mean that most of the people in your society have to sell what makes them human. What makes you human is your activity, your work of head and hands. To be a human being is to act in certain ways, which, by the way, other species don't act in. So you sell your purposeful work of head and hands. You sell that to somebody else in order to eat regularly. And that somebody else, since he owns the means of production, the tools you need, or the space you need, or the area you need in order to use your talents of head and hands. We're physical beings, after all. We don't live entirely in ethereal realms. The profit that is taken from your work is returned to you only partially. And you take that partial return and go buy food. Now that's a system, that's a pretty good system, but the system obviously redounds to the advantage of the owners of those tools and fields and factories and so forth and so on, in a way that is analyzed anew on recent data by Thomas Piketty in the book that Ron was talking about. And it's not at all surprising, it seems to me, at that level of abstraction, that it makes for increasing vast inequality. Now, there are other issues, including the notion, indeed, that Karl Marx himself started with, that it's fundamentally inhuman to take away from someone what makes them human. It literally dehumanizes them when they lose the control, and the control always has to be exercised communally. These are not isolated individuals. The fantasy of the liberal tradition of the isolated individual obviously doesn't work when we come to talk about economics. But the idea that we lose our communal control over our humanity, over our work of head and hands, that we have to give that up in order to eat regularly, points up that capitalism and democracy are fundamentally opposed, not just skew, not just involved in different things, they're opposed to one another. We make it a point, even in the formal democracy that still exists in this country, that the ideal should be one person, one vote. But if we listen to Mr. Koch here, the ideal is $1, one vote. And the freedom that he's talking about is the freedom for large piles of money to do what their owners want. Now these are fundamental differences that should be talked about. I think actually it's a good sign that someone like Cook or Koch, I think he says actually, doesn't he?
Well, I thought it was Koch.
I don't know. I think Koch then. I'm not sure. the fact that he feels he has to step up and defend himself and do it so badly, as you point out, Ron, seems to me to be a good sign. He knows that what he's doing and the way he's defending it are under attack, as it should be. And I think that part of it is the generational thing you're talking about, Karen. I think our rulers know there is a very real chance that it won't be long before people saying, well, why do things have to be this way? Why are there no jobs? There's work to be done. There are people who want to do the work. Why can't they be put together? And you tell me it can't unless someone wants to go out and hire me. There's something wrong with that. I think our rulers are worried. I really do. And I mean both political and economic rulers. And that's why we get articles like this by this man who has lived in the shadows of the 1% for the longest time. That seems to me a good sign.
Yeah. You're talking about one of the Koch brothers, right?
Yes, yeah, Charles.
Oh, yeah.
His article in the Wall Street Journal this week.
I didn't know their
Right, yeah.
first names. Yeah. Okay.
You're watching News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook, Karen Aram, and Ron Szoke talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. I've got a specific on this general theme of the economy that we're speaking of. What do you think of the tax proposals in Illinois?
Oh,
Take on that?
well, I'm not sure what you mean. The extension
there are
of
two.
the extension of the tax increase that so many people are denouncing, and the graduated income tax. State income
Well,
tax.
actually, there's 3 points here. In Illinois, there has been a discussion about taxes, mainly because Illinois isn't paying its bills, and in order to pay its bills, it suggested that it should raise a little money by taxing people. And there are 3, as Ron suggests, connected issues that emerged specifically in the last week or so in Illinois. The first is the ongoing press by the so-called liberal Democrats for a progressive income tax. The state constitution requires a flat income tax, and the notion is the constitution be changed to allow a progressive income tax. In response to that, the leader of the House in Illinois, Speaker Madigan, has done what seems to me to be a very clever thing. He said, no, he says, let's not go to the trouble of changing the Constitution for a progressive tax. People are afraid that will simply raise everybody's taxes. Let's tax millionaires. Let's put a 3% surtax on incomes in excess of $1 million. That strikes me as genius. It's a step towards what really should be done, what Thomas Piketty, for example, recommends, and that is a tax on wealth. Now, taxing wealth is more complicated than simply rearranging the income tax. But I like Speaker Madigan's suggestion, and I think he's eminently political figure, seeing where he counts votes both in the legislature and in the state at large, and he thinks he can get this passed, whereas the progressive income tax, probably not. So it seems to me like it's a clever move and probably should be supported.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. The other text, the thing I think you were referring to, Ron, was Governor Quinn's suggestion that the recent increase in the state income tax, the flat income tax, to 5%, which was announced as temporary because of the economic emergency, should be continued, that it shouldn't drop back to 3.75 as is supposed to the first of the year. That seems to me eminent sense too, and it's only people like Mr. Koch and so forth who are attacking this viciously on the grounds that the governor promised us and now he's taking back his promise. This is nonsense. I mean, what we're talking about is how the very real deficits in state programs, important programs, health, education, welfare, so forth, are to be made up. And I'm quite amazed to find myself saying that this week has found 2 excellent proposals in that direction from Democrats. I'm not usually in the mood to praise Democrats at the state or any other level, but it seems to me in this case they're right.
Was there some third point about the state taxes?
with the progressive attempt to amend the Constitution to allow for a progressive income tax.
Yeah.
I mean, once again, progressive income tax seems to me to be a poor second to wealth taxes, and that we really should start talking about wealth taxes. And there are a lot. And if we were having a serious discussion about the problems that the Piketty book raises, that would be on the table.
My problem with that is wealth tax seems an even higher mountain to climb. But anyway.
Beg pardon?
Wealth tax seems a even higher mountain to climb. But
oh yeah, you mean just in terms of the political discussion to
Right,
get people to agree to it? Yes, I think that's right, and that's a result of the immense propaganda work by the 1% over literally generations, going deep into the 20th century. Remember, look, we had to amend the Constitution to get an income tax in the first place. We had to amend the Constitution, as you pointed out at the beginning, to get an inheritance tax in the United States. We're talking about the federal Constitution here. So it would be worthwhile if these discussions were going on, but of course they're ruled out by the limits of allowable debate. That's what we should think. That's what we should be assaulting, I think, as we try to do here at News from Neptune.
So I have a question then. So basically the reason why you would have voted with majority on the Supreme Court is because you feel that that proposal was simply a Band-Aid, like a neoliberal Band-Aid, which would not have solved the problem.
I think that's true. The reason I would have voted with the majority on those two cases is the fact that we have a First Amendment. And the First Amendment says that you cannot limit public speech by egregious means. And saying, I'm sorry, you can't buy an ad to say that, is to me limiting speech by egregious means.
Okay, I see. Another question I have on neoliberalism is, since I've always supported strong social protection, and I have a good friend who actually wrote a book on it, and she's proposing that Europe, the U.S., et cetera, get behind these very strong social protection initiatives to eliminate poverty, or to alleviate poverty. It won't eliminate it. But, so I'm asking myself now, would this, I think for many people, this would appear to be more neoliberal tactics, even though it helps people. Microfinancing, Social Security, giving more money to health care and education helps individuals. But perhaps some people would see that as more neoliberal programs that only helps individuals and doesn't really change the situation. I just wonder what your opinions on that were.
I mean,
you don't good. Okay, good, because I support it.
As G.K. Chesterton said, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Right? I mean, if you're going to...
I'm sorry, I don't get that.
No, if you have a program that will eliminate poverty, but not completely, if you have a program that will alleviate poverty, but only a little, probably a good idea to do it.
Okay,
yeah. Start there.
Good.
Yeah. I agree with that. If something is worth doing at all, it's worth doing badly.
That's right.
Then you can improve.
That's right. Exactly. And that applies to some very interesting real-world issues like the ACA, like Obamacare, for example.
Well, I was just going to, that was my next question. Well, isn't that the criticism of Obamacare, is that it doesn't really alleviate the problem. It will help significant individuals.
Yes, that's true. But the real point is that Obamacare was constructed to protect the profits of the insurance companies, which it does. And in order to do that, it had to throw a sop to the public at large, which was indeed, there are people who will get medical insurance, who will get medical care as a result of the ACA that would not have it otherwise. Therefore, it is a good thing, capital G, capital T, on Chesterton's maxim. For things worth doing, it's worth doing badly. But anyone who says, okay, we've taken care of health care now, let's go talk about something else, those are the people we grab, throw against the wall, and say, let's have an honest health care system like all the other developed countries have.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah. No, I thought that needed to be clarified.
I hear that one again and again. Doing this will not completely solve the problem and eliminate it 100% eternally. Of course not.
Yeah, right.
That's really a silly objection to anything. But keep hearing it again and again. People seem to think that they're making some kind of devastating point, and they're not at all.
Right.
It's interesting as a question of public policy, public politics, the form of political discussion in this country, exactly how the opponents of Obamacare have been able to use it as they do. There's a study of propaganda that seems to me that really would benefit from close attention. It is difficult for me to understand the way in which the vast hostility to Obamacare has been generated. My suspicion, my hypothesis, is that people realize that they're being ripped off. People realize the government is not working for them, but is working for the 1%. Therefore, if the government has a new program, it must in some way not be good for the majority, but good for only for the 1%. And the sneaky thing, of course, the Obama administration has done is made it slightly good for the majority and very good for the 1%. So in that sense, the public perception is right. But the hostility, which has been organized by opponents of the administration for their own purposes, draws on this distress, this notion that something, something's being, people know that the government is not run for their purposes. And therefore, whenever the government does anything, they're properly critical of it. Now, if we can take that same sort of criticism and apply it to things like foreign policy, we might be in good shape.
Well, the reason I'm interested in your opinions on these is because since I was in Turkey, I've been researching the political situation there, and as we know, President Erdogan just won re-election. And I remembered almost a year ago, I attended a forum here in Champaign whereby some Turkish students were speaking out against him.
Right.
And at that time, their Taksim Square area, there were a lot of uprisings against him. But I came to discover that, and there have been a lot of charges of corruption, etc., but I've discovered that he implemented health care for people.
Oh, yes.
And it's improved significantly to the point where now you don't even have to prove how much your earnings are to qualify. I've seen the infrastructure projects that have been completed there. I've seen how there has been so much building. I agreed with the protesters that most Turks do not want to become an Islamic society. They're very modern, and they want to stay that way. And I agree with the protesters that they don't need any more shopping malls. They did not want this particular park turned into a shopping mall. But when I see the things that he has done and the people that support him are the Islamists who have a tendency to be poor. They tend to be the poorest of the people there. The group that he has been helping. So I also have to look at the fact that his opponent in this election was evidently supported by the United States. So it makes me wonder if he's doing something that we're not happy with.
Well, I think so.
It takes more research, and I'm not gotten all the information I need.
This is an important point we should talk about. As you suggest, it plays in both to foreign policy and economic policy of the United States, and once again, a story that's not being much told in this country. We want to draw on your expertise on that in future programs. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 14th week of 2014. We remind you that there is an anti-war demonstration tomorrow in downtown Champaign, tomorrow afternoon, 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Streets, sponsored by the local peace group AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. We should be there, and I hope you can be too. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and Ron Szoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come endures in my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.